Anyways, so this is I've labeled this first section like Kipp's focus, because he seems to really focus in on this part, and so he kind of has a pretty good lead up to discussing it. And it does, if anybody wants to check the original video that Kipp put up, I do have it in the description. You'll notice that whenever the video dips to white, that's where I've made a cut, and it does jump around a little bit. I've tried to put it in a more linear sort of logical order than Kipp has it in his video. That's not a dig at Kipp or anything like that. I just wanted a clear, logical, like reading from one thing to the next. So we're gonna take a look at him leading up to the Talmud references.
Okay.
We're going to start with his treatment of element 5 and these early Jewish texts, but I think it's important to note at the outset that Carrier clearly knows neither Hebrew nor Aramaic, and this is significant because these are the source languages of all of these texts. It also seems obvious to me.
Kudos. No, I love it when people actually bother to find my CV. Yeah, like I don't pretend that I am an expert in Hebrew or Aramaic at all. I outright say that I do not have that language. But yeah, continue.
That he doesn't really have a good understanding of most of the Jewish texts that he attempts to interpret, and doesn't really have a good sense of how Jewish scripture exegesis even works.
Okay,
yeah, that's set up, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, how do you feel about being represented that way by
it's
Dr.
ridiculous.
Kipp?
It's polemical and ridiculous, especially since everything I say is based on experts. Like, yeah. I'm not making this stuff up. Like, I'm getting this from other experts, and I cite them, right? So this isn't out of the blue. That's the thing that I find really annoying when like he represents to the audience as if I'm just some crazy wacko who's coming up with all this stuff. Like I'm some amateur who just read the Talmud and thought some things. I thought some thoughts and then wrote them down. There's a reason my book passed peer review, is that everything in it is actually based on citations and arguments of other scholars who've passed peer review with their arguments. So especially with Hebrew and Aramaic, I'm very careful to rely on experts in Hebrew and Aramaic for any argument I make that relies on those languages. I do not make any original arguments from those languages. And that's why Davis can't find any examples of me actually making any mistakes with Hebrew and Aramaic, because I never make any arguments like that. But anyway, like we'll get to where he does go off the rails. And it's always about misinterpreting what my argument is. And then he tries to infer what my argument must have been. And then he critiques that argument, which is an argument he just made up and thinks is my argument, even though that argument is nowhere on the page and not in the text. That's what most of the rest of the video is about. And so we can continue from there to see how that proceeds.
For element 5, he says this: even before Christianity arose, some Jews expected one of their messiahs heralding the end times would actually be killed rather than be immediately victorious. And this would mark the key point of a timetable guaranteeing the end of the world soon thereafter. Such a concept was therefore not a Christian novelty, wholly against the grain of Jewish thinking, but already exactly what some Jews were thinking, or could easily have thought. This is the most controversial element in our background knowledge, he admits, many scholars being so intent on denying it.
So yeah, that's basically, I had that clip in there just so that everybody understood like element 5. Now that's not the full element 5, obviously. That's just like I believe that's just sort of the introduction to element 5.
Yeah, but it sets up what the proposition is that the rest of the text defends. So it's fair of him to state that that's the thesis of the element, right? Like that's the hypothesis, the statement, and then everything after that is evidence for the statement. I think he's handling that correctly, at least up to that point.
Right, exactly. No, yeah, I wasn't in disagreement. Also, the way that the font that he used to present it, like it's really weird. Incredibly hard to read.
I was wondering if that was an error of somehow in your display, but no, that was actually the thing. No, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I don't remember that, but yeah, that was a bad choice on his part.
In his unpacking of element 5, he attempts to draw from a variety of Jewish texts in an effort to demonstrate his ideas about this messianic figure who would be killed and whose death would mark or signify the ushering in of the kingdom of God thereafter. We're going to look at these Jewish texts to see how carefully he is at exegeting and interpreting them. And this fifth element...
Like, I have no idea why this is in here, but for some reason, Kipp put it in.
Kind of bleeds into the sixth one. He depends on a couple of key passages here. Isaiah chapter 52 to 53 are part of what scholars call second Isaiah, which is comprised of what they also identify as the servant songs. These are poems or hymns that were written sometime during or very shortly after the Babylonian exile, in which the nation of Israel is personified as a servant of Yahweh whose suffering would usher in the kingdom of God and an age of prosperity and peace for the entire world. So he's marrying this with depictions of certain figures within Daniel chapter 9 and then extrapolating from those into his own interpretation into the actual historical figure, the first priest of the Second Temple, Yehoshua. And he's attempting to show that there's already these complementary ideas within these early Jewish texts that are adopted through Christianity. So
yeah. Before we get into the actual Talmud portion here in a minute, like, I was a little thrown off by this section, primarily because Kipp makes it out to be like you're making a novel argument,
right,
that's not based in current scholarship.
Yeah.
And when I read through it, that's not what I find. Like, what I find when I read through it is that you're citing other like scholars that specialize in these areas and are just reporting what the scholarship says.
Exactly. It's pretty common view in the field that Daniel 9 is riffing on Isaiah 52. That the connection between the two is explicit in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they definitely, even if the authors of Daniel weren't thinking of it, although many scholars say they were, the readers of Daniel before Christianity were definitely making a connection. They saw some connection between them. It's also true, by the way, that he skips over Wisdom of Solomon. I have a whole paragraph on the Wisdom of Solomon in this section. And that's also the case. It's the scholarship's pretty mainstream conclusion is that the Wisdom of Solomon chapters 2 and 5, which are the ones I talk about, are riffing on Isaiah 52 to 53. So there's this whole network of texts that Jews are already seeing as talking about the same thing. And what I'm doing is I'm just relating what these scholars have said. And yeah, I'm doing it because there are scholars who deny this. But those denials don't make any sense in context. When you read the scholars who are making these arguments that I'm relating, and by the way, I guess we'll get to the point, there's way more scholars than I cite. I just cite the ones that I relied on in the book, but there's a ton more. Like, so I'm not alone in this at all. But yeah, that's all I'm doing. I didn't invent any of this. The only thing that gets more into my own exegesis is in element 6, and I can't remember what he talks about in element 6. There's some wording in element 6 that I would change, and I haven't updated my typos list for what I would change in element 6. So there could be things that I would agree with him in terms of ways I could have reworded element 6, but I don't remember what he says about it. But element 5, no, everything in there is just right out of the scholarship.
Yeah, and so I've taken from Dr. Carrier's write-up, his long-form blog post that's in the description. These are screenshots from that where you can see on the left-hand side there, those are the actual things that are mentioned in OHJ. Right. And then on the right side, those are other scholarly sources that also back up the element 5.
Exactly. And then you would add to those 10, I got published under this argument, published under peer review, and Lataster, who also made the same argument, published under peer review separately from me. So that's 12 now, right? Like 12 of us. And I'm sure that's not a complete list, right? Like that's just the list that I'm sitting on right now is at 12 scholars who make essentially the same argument. All of these different scholars make slightly different arguments. A lot of them will argue things that I don't agree with. A lot of them will argue extra things and so on. But the general gist of the idea that there was a notion, a pre-Christian notion in Judaism of a dying Messiah, that has a lot of scholarly support. And yeah, as I point out, and Kipp even like highlights it as like, yeah, it's still debated, it's still controversial. But the evidence is pretty strong that it's at least plausible, if not certain, right? So, and that's, you know, once you've got 12 different scholars, and by the way, like peer review is normally at least a minimum of 2 peer reviewers. So if there's 12 scholars who made this argument, that means there's 24 more scholars who said yeah to that, right? And one of these is a dissertation, at least. So Staples, that's Bart Ehrman, right? Bart Ehrman was his dissertation advisor. So Bart Ehrman signed off on this. So this is approved by Bart Ehrman. This is a conclusion approved by Bart Ehrman himself. So Bart Ehrman we'd add. And when you do a dissertation, that's the most peer-reviewed work that exists in scholarship. You have usually at least a minimum of 4 peer reviewers. I had 5 for my dissertation, but 4 or 5, that's pretty normal. And you have to pass all of them, and they grill the fuck out of you, right? So like it's you know the most intense peer review that you can get for anything. So it's Staples' dissertation is that, and the book is the published version of it. So this is important. So if you could bring up Staples, I have the image, the picture from Staples' book, because this really sets the definition. And Staples, by the way, his book is on Israel. He's a specialist in Second Temple Judaism, so he knows what he's talking about. He's not some rando. Right. So for the links between the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 and 53 and this anointed one that is cut off, he's referring to Daniel 9. He lists some people, scholars, many scholars, and then he concludes at the bottom of that footnote, the oft-repeated dictum. I noticed also it's an oft-repeated dictum, and that was the thing that Kipp highlighted. The oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying, quote-unquote, anointed one, that's what Messiah means, or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism is therefore mistaken. So this isn't me. I'm not some rando here. This is mainstream now. This is pretty well established.
Yeah. And so one pushback that I've received on bringing up Staples' citation here is, and his relation to Bart Ehrman is that, well, it doesn't matter because Bart doesn't have to agree with it. And
no,
if you look at Bart,
he does have to agree that it's like competent, right?
Right.
Because this is what would happen. Like if Ehrman thought that this should not pass peer review, he would tell him, you have to reword this, or you have to present more citations. Or in fact, that's probably how this footnote came to exist, incidentally, is that he wanted to make this point. Ehrman said, you can't say that because there's no evidence. He says, well, what if I get like 3 citations of scholars saying this? I say, well, all right. And then he put that in, but Ehrman even signs off on the last sentence, which means that like, he's like, okay, you've made your case. So the thing is, like, Ehrman doesn't have to agree that with the conclusion. He doesn't have to agree that this is all true, but he does have to agree that everything that is said in this footnote is true, that the way it's worded is true, that the idea that there is some evidence for this. That's basically what Staples is saying. So there's evidence for this. There's scholars who've established this. This is not some shit I'm making up. And that's true. And that's what Ehrman would sign off on. So whether Ehrman agrees with the conclusion or not, yeah, we can't infer that, but we can infer that he thinks that this is a competent statement. It deserves to pass peer review. It's not something you can rat off as being incompetent the way that Kipp Davis wants to try and call it. No, it's not. It's a fairly mainstream position to take in the field now.
And I mean, one thing that I found that was pretty interesting was that the citations that Staples provides goes back to like 1953. Like,
yeah. Right.
This has been like a thing in the scholarship since 1953.
Yeah. I ran into that a lot. There's other things that I ran into when I was doing On the Historicity of Jesus that I was surprised more than one time where I would come to a conclusion. Like I would look at the evidence, I'd come to a conclusion. Like, wow, there's no way am I the only one who notices this? And I go, well, I better do a literature review. And I do a literature review. And then I find like multiple scholars independent of each other found the same thing and didn't read each other. So like multiple scholars come up with it and then it gets forgotten. And then another one comes up with it and it gets forgotten. And then I come along and I come to the same conclusion. And then I go and check and I go, shit, we should start reading our own literature. An example is the Barabbas, Leviticus interpretation of the Barabbas episode is one of those where it was multiply independently discovered by multiple scholars for like the last 60, 70 years. Including me. I came to it independently on my own and then checked to see, like, am I full of shit? Like, what, am I seeing things? And no, I found multiple scholars corroborated it. So that happens a lot. So yeah, I think that's a good point to note that, yes, his citations start in 53.
Where does Carrier get this idea? He says that it comes from the Talmud. The Talmud provides us with a proof of concept at the very least, an actual confirmation at the very most. It explicitly says the suffering servant who dies in Isaiah 53 is the Messiah, and that the Messiah will endure great suffering before his death. Carrier has included a footnote at this point in his text, which draws our attention to two tractates from the Babylonian Talmud. That's Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 98b and 93b. And these, I assume, provide the so-called explicit proof that the suffering servant who dies in Isaiah 53 is the Messiah.
Right.
Yeah, he says two tractates. That would be one tractate. I think when he says two, he's including the next footnote. If people notice that there's Sukkah is also in there, and he'll get to that. So he's not making a mistake. He's not confusing two references to Sanhedrin as two tractates. He knows he's going to talk about the second one later on. Yeah, exactly. My wording is very important here. And this is a case where he's a little lazy, and he misreads me as saying that these passages talk about a dying Messiah. That's not what I say. I say that they talk about the passage referring to the Messiah, and we'll get to why that's relevant. That's very important in my wording is relevant to this. So we'll get to that.
Well, yeah, and I think the way that Kipp kind of worded this was like you were making this argument. Like
Right.
and for all of this, he seems to ignore the fact that you cite experts in this area.
Yeah, one wonders, like, where does he think I got this? Does he think I sat and read, like, how many volumes? Like 40 volumes? It's a huge. Have you ever seen the Talmud? It's a wall of books. Do you think I just read the Talmud and found them? No, I found there's these scholars talking about it, like experts.
I mean, Rick, obviously you did a keyword search for Messiah and just listed all the references you found about it.
Well, I have to say the ones you're going to bring up, the pictures you're going to bring up are from an online Talmud that did not exist when I published in 2014, and I'm impressed with it. Like, it is a really excellent resource. This new online Talmud, it was one of my biggest complaints when I was working on it, is how hard it is to find the Talmud, right? Like to any text of the Talmud to refer to. And I was so frustrated that no one had like a reliable, thorough version of it online. Now they do, and it's fantastic. But that didn't exist back then. I couldn't use it. I don't even know if it does word searches. I haven't played around in that website.
No, I don't know if it does word searches for the entire Talmud, but I know you can search in the page, and I've got one of my images has like a highlights of the word Messiah.
And the thing is, it's a lot of pages. The Talmud is huge. Right. I don't know if people realize how huge it is. It's massive.
Right.
And so Encyclopedia Britannica is nothing compared to the Talmud. It's massive.
Yeah.